Sometimes the hardest battles we fight aren't against our enemies, but against the demons we've become. Every man deserves a second chance, even those who've forgotten they're still human underneath all that anger and pain. Tex Bridger was the most feared man in Silver Ridge, a giant who made grown folks hide behind locked doors. For 20 years, his reputation spread like wildfire across 3 counties. Mothers pulled their children close when they saw his shadow on Main Street. Even the sheriff looked the other way when Tex came calling. The townspeople whispered his name like a curse, knowing that death followed wherever his spurs jangled. But one dusty afternoon, when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and fear, a 7-year-old girl named Rosie would do what no grown man had ever dared. She looked the most dangerous gunslinger in the territory straight in the eye and refused to back down. What could possibly make a child brave enough to face down a man who'd never known mercy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Ridge, but even the warmth of dawn couldn't chase away the chill that had settled over the town like a permanent fog. For 20 years, this place had lived under a cloud. A fear so thick you could almost taste it in the air, metallic and bitter, like blood mixed with desert sand. Tex Bridger's worn leather holster hung heavy on his hip as he rode into town that Tuesday morning, the same way he'd done every week. For 2 decades, the holster itself told a story written in scuffs and stains, each mark a testament to violence delivered without mercy. 23 notches carved into the leather, one for each man who'd fallen to his Colt 45. The townspeople had stopped, counting after the first dozen. But Tex never forgot a single life he'd taken. At 6 feet 8 inches in his weathered boots, Tex cast a shadow that seemed to swallow everything in its path. His broad shoulders stretched the faded fabric of his black duster, and his hands, Lord, those hands, looked like they could crush a man's windpipe without breaking a sweat. Deep lines etched his face like canyons carved by years of squinting into the sun and scowling at the world. His eyes, once perhaps blue as a summer sky, had turned the color of winter storm clouds, cold, distant, and promising nothing but trouble. The rhythm of his horse's hooves on the packed earth was like a death knell to the folks of Silver Ridge. Windows slammed shut with such force that glass rattled in their frames. Doors banged closed, followed by the scraping sound of furniture being dragged against them as makeshift barricades. Children who'd been playing in the street just moments before vanished like smoke, their laughter replaced by the whispered urgency of mothers calling them. Inside, Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, had been hanging laundry when she spotted Tex's silhouette on the horizon. She dropped her washing basket so fast that clean sheets tumbled into the dirt, but she didn't stop to retrieve them. Her feet barely touched the ground as she ran for her back door, calling over her shoulder to old Henry, who was sweeping He porched 3 houses down. He's coming! Tex is coming! The warning spread through Silver Ridge faster than wildfire through dry grass. In the general store, Mr. Hawkins ushered the last customer out and threw the bolt across his door with shaking hands. At the saloon, Big Mike, a man who'd never backed down from a fight in his 43 years, quietly slipped out the back entrance and disappeared into the alley between buildings. This was how Silver Ridge had learned to survive, like prairie. Animals that freeze at the shadow of a hawk. The townspeople had developed an instinct for making themselves invisible whenever Tex Bridger came to call. It wasn't cowardice exactly. It was survival. You didn't reason with a rattlesnake, and you certainly didn't try to stare down a man who'd killed more folks than the cholera outbreak of '67. The sheriff's office sat at the corner of Main and Prospect, its windows dark despite the early hour. Sheriff Dalton had learned long ago that his badge meant nothing when Tex came to town. The first and last time he'd tried to assert his authority, Tex had lifted him clean off his feet and held him against the jailhouse wall until his face turned purple. The message was clear. This town belonged to Tex Bridger, and the law could go to hell. But in a small white house at the end of Maple Street, where morning glories climbed a picket fence that had seen better days, 7-year-old Rosie McKinnon sat on her front porch steps, working a piece of wood with a small knife her grandfather had given her before he passed. Her nimble fingers carved gentle curves into what would become a horse. Not just any horse, but a faithful companion for the wooden cowboy she'd finished last week. The hand-carved wooden horse was taking shape beautifully under her patient care. Each careful cut revealed more of the creature hiding in the pinewood, waiting to gallop free. Her late father had taught her the craft during the precious few years they'd had together before consumption took him away. Every piece of wood has a story inside it, he used to say, guiding her small hands with his calloused ones. You just have to listen carefully enough to hear what it wants to become. Rosie's mother, Helen, watched from the kitchen window as her daughter worked with the same focused concentration her father had possessed. Helen's heart ached with a mixture of pride and worry. The child had inherited more than just her father's artistic talents. She'd also gotten his stubborn streak and his complete inability to back down from anything he believed was right. "Rosie, honey," Helen called through the open window, her voice carrying that particular tone mothers use when they're trying not to alarm their children while desperately wanting them to come inside. "Why don't you come help me with the bread? I could use an extra pair of hands," but Rosie was absorbed in her carving, adding tiny details to the horse's mane. She'd inherited her father's steady hands and patient nature, but more importantly, she'd inherited something else. Something that would prove far more dangerous and far more powerful than anyone in Silver Ridge could imagine. The sound of approaching. Hoofbeats caused Helen to grip the windowsill until her knuckles went white. She knew that sound the way other folks knew their own heartbeat. Heavy, deliberate, each step measured and menacing. Tex Bridger was making his weekly rounds, and here was her daughter, sitting in plain sight like she didn't have sense enough to hide. "Rosie," Helen's voice took on an edge of panic. "Come inside this instant." But something extraordinary happened as Tex's massive form came into view around the bend in Maple Street. Instead of scrambling for safety like every other living soul in Silver Ridge, Rosie McKinnon looked up from her carving and watched the approaching rider with curious eyes that held no trace of fear. She'd heard the stories, of course. Every child in Silver Ridge had been raised on tales of Tex Bridger's terrible deeds. They knew about the bank robbery in Millerville, where he'd gunned down 3 men in broad daylight. They'd whispered about the time he'd burned down the trading post in Cedar Falls, just because the owner had looked at him wrong. The adults spoke his name in hushed tones, as if saying it too loud might summon him like some evil spirit. But as Rosie sat there on her porch steps, wooden horse in one hand and carving knife in the other, she felt something that no one else in Silver Ridge had felt in 20 years when faced with Tex Bridger. She felt curious rather than terrified. Here was a man so feared that grown folks scattered like leaves before him, yet something about him struck her as deeply, profoundly sad. Her father had taught her to see beyond the surface of things. "People aren't always what they appear to be, little bird," he'd told her in his gentle voice. "Sometimes the angriest folks are just the most hurt." It was a lesson that had stuck with her even after his death. And now, watching this legendary figure of terror approach her quiet street, she found herself wondering what kind of hurt could turn a man into such a fearsome creature. The wooden horse felt warm in her palm, as if her father's spirit lived on in the work of her hands. She thought about the stories he used to tell her about his own father, who'd been a lawman before the war. "Courage isn't about not being afraid," he'd said. "It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid." As Tex drew closer, his horse's hooves clicking against the stones in the street, Rosie made a decision that would change everything for both of them. Instead of running inside to hide with her mother, she stood up, brushed the wood shavings from her simple blue dress, and waited. The morning sun caught the silver in Tex's beard and the worn metal of his spurs, but it also revealed something. else something in his eyes that looked almost human underneath all that hardness. For just a moment, as their gazes met across the distance between the street and her porch, Rosie saw not a monster, but a man carrying a burden so heavy it had bent his very soul. And in that moment, she made up her mind to do something that would either be the bravest or most foolish thing anyone had done in Silver Ridge for 20 years. The afternoon sun hung like a brass coin in the cloudless sky when Tex Bridger dismounted in front of Hawkins's general store, his spurs ringing against the wooden steps with each measured step. Inside the store, he could hear the frantic whispers of folks who'd been caught shopping when the warning spread through town. The familiar sound of people scrambling to hide behind counters and barrels brought a grim satisfaction to his weathered face. He wasn't here for supplies. Tex never bought anything in Silver Ridge. His presence served a different purpose entirely. Every week, he made these rounds to remind the townspeople exactly who held the real power in their quiet little community. Fear was a currency more valuable than gold or silver, and Tex had built his entire existence on being the richest man in that particular economy. The silver locket around Rosie's neck caught the sunlight as she stepped down from her porch, her small bare feet making no sound on the dusty street. The locket had belonged to her mother, but Helen had given it to Rosie on her 7th birthday, along with the photograph it contained. A picture of her father, in his deputy's uniform, taken just days before he died. The image was small and faded, but Rosie could still make out his kind eyes and the gentle smile that had made her feel safe, even in her darkest moments. She clutched the wooden horse tight in her left hand as she walked toward the center of town, following the sound of Tex's boots on the boardwalk. Behind her, she could hear her mother calling frantically from the window, but something stronger than fear pulled her forward. Maybe it was the memory of her father's courage, or maybe it was simple curiosity about this man who could make an entire town disappear with nothing more than his presence. Tex emerged from the general store, carrying nothing, having accomplished exactly what he'd come for. Another successful reminder that Silver Ridge belonged to him. The store's windows were dark now, and he could see the shapes of people huddled behind overturned tables and stacks of goods. Mr. Hawkins would stay hidden for at least an hour after Tex left, just to be absolutely certain the danger had passed. That's when he saw her, a small figure in a blue dress, standing in the middle of Main Street like she had every right to be there. For a moment, Tex thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. In 20 years of terrorizing Silver Ridge, he'd never seen anyone, man, woman, or child, simply stand in the open and watch him approach. The sight was so unexpected that he actually stopped walking, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. Rosie looked up at the towering figure before her, taking in every detail of the man who had haunted her town's nightmares for as long as she could remember. Up close, he was even larger than the stories made him out to be, but something about his eyes caught her attention. They weren't the eyes of a monster. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen too much pain and had forgotten how to feel anything else. "I'm not afraid of you," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly in the unnatural silence that had fallen over Silver Ridge. The words hit Tex like a physical blow. In 2 decades of spreading terror across 3 counties, no one had ever spoken to him with such calm certainty. Children screamed when they saw him coming. Grown men crossed the street to avoid him. Women gathered their skirts and ran rather than risk being in his presence. But this little girl stood there like she was commenting on the weather, her small chin lifted in quiet defiance. "What did you say?" Tex's voice came out as a growl, rough from years of shouting commands and threats. "I said I'm not afraid of you." Rosie repeated the words with the same gentle firmness her father had used when explaining why sometimes you had to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Tex's massive hands clenched into fists at his sides. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. People were supposed to fear him. That fear was the foundation of everything he'd built, the source of his power, the reason towns like Silver Ridge bent to his will without resistance. A 7-year-old girl couldn't simply decide not to be afraid and upset the entire order of his world. "You should be," he said, taking a step closer, his shadow falling across her small form. "Do you know who I am, little girl?" "You're Tex Bridger," Rosie replied matter-of-factly. "You're the man who makes everyone hide when you come to town. But I don't think you're as mean as everyone says you are." The statement was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything Tex had spent 20 years building, that for a moment he couldn't form words. His reputation had been carefully cultivated through acts of calculated brutality. Every man he'd killed, every town he'd terrorized, every act of violence he'd committed had been designed to build the legend of Tex Bridger into something so fearsome that his mere presence would be enough to control anyone he encountered. And yet, here stood this child, looking at him like he was just another person, instead of the walking nightmare he'd worked so hard to become. "You don't know what you're talking about," Tex said, his voice quieter now but no less menacing. "I've killed more men than you have years on this earth. I've burned towns to the ground and left widows crying in the ashes. I am exactly as mean as they say I am, and worse." Rosie tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the kind of open curiosity that only children possess. "If you're so mean, then why haven't you hurt me yet?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Tex realized with a start that she was right. He should have already drawn his weapon, should have used violence to reassert his dominance and restore the natural order of things. Instead, he found himself standing there, engaging in conversation with a child who refused to acknowledge his power over her. Around them, Silver Ridge held its collective breath. Behind shuttered windows and closed doors, the townspeople watched, in amazement and terror, as their worst nightmare was challenged by their most innocent resident. Mrs. Patterson pressed her face against her kitchen window, certain she was about to witness something terrible. Sheriff Dalton crouched behind his desk, his hand on his gun, but his courage nowhere to be found. Tex's jaw worked silently as he struggled with emotions he hadn't felt in decades. The child's fearlessness was like a mirror held up to his soul, reflecting back not the monster he'd become, but something else, something vulnerable and human that he'd thought was dead and buried. "You need to go home," he said finally, his voice lacking the menace he usually commanded. "Right now, I will," Rosie said agreeably. "But first, I wanted to give you this." She held out the wooden horse she'd been carving, offering it to him, with the same easy generosity she might show to any friend. The toy was simple but beautifully crafted, smooth from her careful sanding, and detailed with the kind of patient love that only comes from hands guided by genuine affection. Tex stared down at the offered gift, his mind reeling. No one had given him anything in 20 years except fear and hatred. The idea that this child, this brave, impossible child, wanted to give him something she'd made with her own hands was so far outside his experience that he couldn't process it. "I don't want your toy," he said harshly. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt wrong. Rosie's smile didn't waver. "That's okay. I'll just leave it here in case you change your mind." She set the wooden horse down on the steps of the general store, right where he'd have to see it every time he came to town. Then she turned and walked back toward her house with the same calm confidence she'd shown throughout their entire encounter, her mother's silver locket catching the afternoon light as she moved. Tex watched her go, his whole world tilted off, its axis by one small girl's refusal to be afraid. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't know what to do next. That night, Tex Bridger sat beside his campfire 3 miles outside of Silver Ridge, staring into the flames like they might hold answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. His weathered hands shook slightly as he poured another shot of whiskey from the bottle that had become his constant companion over the years. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it couldn't burn away the memory of a 7-year-old girl who'd looked at him without fear. Hidden deep in his saddlebags, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay a faded daguerreotype that he hadn't looked. Yet in 15 years, the photograph showed a younger version of himself, clean-shaven, clear-eyed, standing proudly beside a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Between them stood a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, her small hand clutching a wooden doll that her father had carved for her 6th birthday. Tex reached for the photograph now, his calloused fingers trembling as he unwrapped it from its protective covering. The image had faded over the years, edges worn soft from handling, but he could still make out every beloved detail. That man in the picture, that happy, hopeful man, felt like a stranger now. Someone from a different life, a different world. Entirely. His name hadn't always been Tex Bridger. Once he'd been Thomas Brennan, and he'd lived in a small house outside Abilene with his wife Margaret and their daughter Lucy. He'd been a good man then. Not perfect, but decent. He'd worked honest jobs, paid his debts, and came home every evening to a family that loved him. That life seemed as distant now as the stars overhead. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. Tex, Thomas, whoever he was now, took another drink and tried to remember what it felt like to be someone's hero instead of everyone's nightmare. Margaret used to look at him the way that little girl in town had looked at him today, without fear, with something that might have been trust or understanding. Meanwhile, back in Silver Ridge, Rosie McKinnon lay in her small bed, staring up at the ceiling and thinking about the sad man with the frightening reputation. Her mother had scolded her thoroughly for approaching Tex, alternating between tears of relief and anger born of pure terror. But even Helen's worry couldn't shake Rosie's conviction that she'd done the right thing. "Mama," Rosie had asked during their simple supper of cornbread and beans, "why do people become mean?" Helen paused in her eating, considering how to answer such a profound question from such a young child. "Well, honey, sometimes people get hurt so badly that they forget how to be anything else. It's like when you break your arm. It hurts for a long time, and you have to protect it even after it heals. So mean people are just protecting hurt places." "Sometimes," Helen admitted, though the idea of Tex Bridger as someone who'd been hurt rather than someone who only hurt others was difficult for her to accept. "But that doesn't make it right when they hurt other people." Rosie nodded solemnly. "Daddy used to say that hurt people sometimes hurt people, but that doesn't mean they can't get better." The wisdom in her daughter's words made Helen's chest tight with emotion. James had been a good man, patient and kind, and it seemed he'd passed more than just his artistic talents to their daughter. He'd given her his compassionate heart and his ability to see the good in people, even when others couldn't. Back at his campfire, Tex found himself remembering his own daughter's voice. The way Lucy used to chatter excitedly about her day while he carved small animals for her to play with. She'd had the same fearless curiosity as the girl in town, the same way of looking at the world like it was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. The bandits had come on a Tuesday morning, just like today had been. He'd been in the fields, checking on the cattle, when he heard Margaret's scream cut through the morning air like a blade. By the time he reached the house, it was too late. They'd taken everything, his money, his horses, his hope, and left behind only ashes and grief. So profound it had nearly killed him. That's when Thomas Brennan had died and Tex Bridger had been born. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but over months and years of hunting the men who'd destroyed his family. He'd learned to kill efficiently, mercilessly, and when he'd finally found them all and delivered his justice with his own hands, he'd discovered something terrible. The violence hadn't brought his family back, but it had brought him a kind of peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of numbness. Violence became his escape from the pain, and fear became his shield, against ever caring about anything enough to lose it again. Each man he killed, each town he terrorized, had been another step away from the agony of loving someone and losing them. But today, for just a moment, a little girl had looked at him and seen something other than a monster. She'd seen him clearly enough to offer him a gift, a simple wooden horse carved with the same patient love he'd once put into toys for his own daughter. Tex drained his whiskey glass and stared into the dying fire. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled mournfully at the moon, the sound echoing his own internal anguish. He'd spent 20 years running from the memory of what he'd lost, using fear and violence to build walls around his heart so thick that nothing could penetrate them. But walls that kept pain out also kept everything else out: love, hope, connection, the possibility of redemption. Today, a 7-year-old girl had found a crack in those walls, and through that crack light was beginning to seep in. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely unexpected. He thought about the wooden horse sitting on the steps of the general store, waiting for him to decide whether he was brave enough to accept the gift of a child's trust. Tomorrow, he would ride back into Silver Ridge for his weekly rounds, and he would have to choose: pick up that horse and acknowledge the humanity it represented, or leave it there and continue pretending he was nothing more than the monster he'd made himself into. For the first time in 20 years, Tex Bridger wasn't certain which choice he would make. The uncertainty should have bothered him, but instead, it felt almost like hope. The town church bell had stood silent for over 15 years, its bronze surface green with age and neglect. Once, it had called the faithful to Sunday services and announced weddings, births, and celebrations. But when Tex Bridger's reign of terror began, the bell had fallen quiet, another casualty of the fear that had settled over Silver Ridge like a permanent shadow. Thursday morning brought Tex back to town earlier than usual. He told himself it was just another routine patrol, but deep down, he knew better. The wooden horse had haunted his thoughts for 2 days, its simple craftsmanship and generous intent a stark contrast to the ugliness he'd built his life around. As he rode down Main Street, Tex noticed something different in the way the townspeople reacted to his presence. The usual mad scramble for safety was still there, but it seemed somehow less frantic, as if yesterday's encounter with Rosie had introduced a new element into the equation. Windows still slammed shut and doors still locked, but he caught glimpses of faces peering out from behind curtains, watching him with something that might have been curiosity rather than pure terror. The wooden horse still sat exactly where Rosie had left it, perched on the steps of Hawkins's general store like a patient sentry. Tex dismounted slowly, his eyes fixed on the small carved figure. From this close, he could see the careful attention to detail. The flowing mane, the alert ears, the proud stance of a creature born to run free. It was beautiful in its simplicity, crafted with the kind of love that had been absent from his life for so long he'd forgotten it existed. "You came back." The voice made him turn sharply, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun before he recognized the small figure emerging from behind the store. Rosie stepped into view, carrying a handful of prairie flowers, purple lupine and yellow black-eyed Susan, picked from the meadow behind her house. "I figured you might," she continued conversationally, as if talking to armed killers was something she did every day. "The horse is still here if you want it." Tex found himself at a loss for words once again. This child seemed to have a talent for rendering him speechless, something that hadn't happened to him in decades. He stared down at her, this impossibly brave little girl who refused to treat him like the monster he knew himself to be. Why? The word came out rougher than he intended. Why what? Rosie tilted her head, genuinely puzzled. "Why aren't you afraid? Why did you give me—" He gestured toward the wooden horse, unable to finish the sentence. Rosie considered the question seriously, her young face scrunched in concentration. "My daddy told me once that everybody has good in them, even when it's buried real deep. He said sometimes it just takes the right person to help dig it up." The words hit Tex like bullets, each one finding its mark in the armored heart he'd thought was impenetrable. This child, this incredible, impossible child, was trying to dig up good in him that he was certain had died long ago. "Your daddy was wrong," Tex said harshly. "Some people don't have any good left in them." "Maybe," Rosie acknowledged with the gravity of someone much older. "But I don't think you're one of those people." She held out the flowers she'd picked, offering them to him with the same generous spirit she'd shown with the wooden horse. The gesture was so simple, so purely kind, that Tex felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 20 years. From her kitchen window, Helen watched the exchange with her heart in her throat. She could see her daughter standing fearlessly before the most dangerous man in 3 counties, offering him wildflowers like he was a friend instead of a killer. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to run outside and snatch Rosie to safety, but something held her back. Maybe it was the way Tex was looking at her daughter, not with menace or threat, but with something that looked almost like wonder. Other townspeople had begun to notice the strange tableau as well. Mr. Hawkins peered through a crack in his shutters, hardly believing what he was seeing. Mrs. Patterson had abandoned all pretense of hiding and now watched openly from her front porch, her mouth agape. Even Sheriff Dalton had emerged from his office and stood at the edge of the boardwalk, his hand resting on his gun, but his attention fixed on the unprecedented scene unfolding before him. Tex looked down at the flowers in Rosie's small hand. Their bright colors, a shocking contrast to the muted browns and grays that had dominated his world for so long. When was the last time anyone had offered him flowers? When was the last time anyone had offered him anything that wasn't born of fear or desperation? "I don't deserve flowers," he said quietly. "Nobody deserves flowers," Rosie replied with the simple wisdom of childhood, "but everybody needs them. Sometimes." Before Tex could respond, she stepped forward and gently tucked the bouquet into his gun belt, right next to the weapon that had ended so many lives. The contrast was startling. Bright, living beauty nestled against cold, deadly metal. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. "Now you have something pretty to look at." Tex stood frozen, afraid to move or breathe, for fear of disturbing this moment that felt like magic. The flowers smelled like sunshine and innocence, scents so foreign to his experience that they might as well have come from another world entirely. Around them, Silver Ridge held its breath. The townspeople watched in amazement as their worst nightmare stood perfectly still, while a 7-year-old girl decorated his gun belt with prairie flowers. It was impossible, unprecedented, and somehow beautiful in a way that none of them could have imagined. "Will you pick up the horse now?" Rosie asked hopefully. Tex looked down at the wooden carving, then back at the child who'd given it to him. Slowly, as if he were handling something infinitely precious, he bent down and picked up the little horse. It felt warm from sitting in the sun, smooth from careful sanding, perfect in its simple craftsmanship. "Thank you," he said, the words, and coming out like a rusty gate opening for the first time in years. Rosie's smile could have lit up the entire town. "You're welcome, Mr. Tex." As she skipped away toward home, Tex stood holding the wooden horse and wearing prairie flowers, feeling more human than he had in 20 years. Above them all, the silent church bell seemed to shiver slightly in the morning breeze, as if remembering what it felt like to sing. That evening, alone in his camp, Tex found himself turning the wooden horse over and over in his hands while staring at the broken compass that had belonged to his father. The brass instrument lay open in his palm, its needle spinning aimlessly, unable to find true north. He'd carried it for 30 years, though it had been broken for nearly as long, a fitting metaphor for his own lost sense of direction. His father, Captain William Brennan, had been a good man who'd served with honor in the cavalry before settling down to raise cattle and children. He'd given Thomas the compass on his 16th birthday, along with a piece of advice that had seemed wise at the time. "A man needs to know where he's headed, son. This will help you find your way when the path gets unclear." The irony wasn't lost on Tex that he'd been carrying a broken compass for 20 years, just as he'd been living a broken life. When the bandits had murdered his family, they'd shattered more than just his heart. They'd destroyed his moral compass as surely as a hammer blow had destroyed the delicate mechanisms of his father's gift. But something was shifting inside him. Now, something that had started with a child's fearless declaration and was growing stronger with each act of unexpected kindness. The wooden horse seemed to pulse with warmth in his hands, a tangible reminder that goodness still existed in the world, even if he'd forgotten how to recognize it. Meanwhile, in Silver Ridge, word of the flower incident had spread through the community like ripples in a pond. The sight of Tex Bridger standing perfectly still while Rosie McKinnon decorated his gun belt had shaken everyone's understanding of how the world worked. For 15 years, they'd lived by one simple rule: stay out of Tex's way and hope he moved on quickly. Now that rule no longer seemed to apply. Mrs. Patterson found herself baking an extra loaf of bread that night, though she couldn't quite explain why. Something about seeing that massive, terrifying man reduced to speechless wonder by a child's simple gesture had awakened a compassion she'd thought was dead. As she kneaded the dough, she found herself wondering what it would be like to live in a town where people didn't have to hide from their own shadows. At the saloon, the evening conversation had taken an unprecedented turn. Instead of the usual talk about cattle prices and weather, the patrons found themselves discussing the impossible sight they'd witnessed that morning. "I tell you, I seen it with my own eyes," declared Pete Morrison, a rancher whose hands still shook when he talked about the time Tex had burned down his barn. "That little McKinnon girl walked right up to him like he was anybody else, and damned if he didn't just stand there and take it. She gave him flowers," added Jake Sullivan, his voice full of wonder. "Stuck 'em right in his gun belt like she was decorating a church altar." The men sat in contemplative silence, nursing their whiskey and trying to process what it meant. Tex Bridger, the man who'd terrorized their community for 2 decades, had been transformed, however briefly, by the simple kindness of a 7-year-old child. Back at the McKinnon house, Helen tucked Rosie into bed and found herself struggling with emotions she couldn't name. Pride in her daughter's courage warred with terror at the risk she was taking. Rosie seemed completely unaware of the danger she'd placed herself in, treating her encounters with Tex like adventures rather than brushes with death. "Mama," Rosie said as Helen smoothed the quilt over her small form, "do you think Mr. Tex has bad dreams?" The question caught Helen off guard. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart? He looks so sad all the time, like something hurts him real deep inside. Daddy used to look like that sometimes when he thought I wasn't watching." Helen's breath caught in her throat. James had indeed suffered from dark periods, especially near the end when the consumption was eating him alive from the inside. But she'd tried so hard to shield Rosie from that pain, apparently unsuccessfully. "What made Daddy feel better when he was sad?" Helen asked gently. "When I would sit with him and hold his hand," Rosie replied without hesitation. "And when I would tell him stories about happy things. Maybe Mr. Tex needs someone to sit with him too." The innocent wisdom of her daughter's words brought tears to Helen's eyes. Here was this child, barely 7 years old, who could see through 20 years of violence and reputation to the wounded man underneath. It was a gift that James had possessed as well. The ability to see the best in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Miles away, Tex sat by his dying campfire, the wooden horse clutched in one hand and his father's broken compass in the other. For the first time in decades, he found himself thinking about the future instead of just surviving. Each day, what would it be like to live without the weight of fear and hatred pressing down on him? What would it be like to wake up in the morning and not automatically reach for his gun? The prairie flowers had long since wilted in his gun belt, but their sweet scent lingered in his memory like a promise of something better. He tucked them carefully into his saddlebag, unable to throw them away. They were the first gift anyone had given him in 20 years, And despite their simplicity, or perhaps because of it, they meant more to him than all the gold he'd stolen over the years. As the fire burned down to embers, Tex made a decision. That would have seemed impossible just days before. Tomorrow, he would return to Silver Ridge, not to terrorize the townspeople, but to see if that remarkable little girl might teach him something more about being human again. He carefully wrapped the broken compass back in its cloth and placed it next to the wooden horse in his saddlebag. Both were damaged, both were reminders of better times, and both represented the possibility that broken things could still have value, might even be fixed, given enough patience and care. For the first time in 20 years, Tex Bridger fell, asleep, without reaching for his bottle of whiskey. Instead, he held the wooden horse close to his chest and dreamed of a little girl with pigtails who used to call him Papa and believed he could do anything. Friday morning brought unexpected revelations to Silver Ridge. While cleaning out her late husband's belongings, a task she'd been putting off for months, Helen McKinnon discovered something that stopped her cold. Hidden in the bottom of James's cedar chest, wrapped in faded blue cloth, lay a tarnished deputy's badge alongside a yellowed letter of commendation from the territorial marshal. Her hands trembled as she read the citation, dated just 2 years before Rosie's birth. Deputy James McKinnon had been recognized for exceptional courage in pursuing a gang of horse thieves who'd been terrorizing settlements across the territory. The letter described how James had tracked them for 3 weeks through hostile terrain, finally cornering them in a box canyon where he'd arrested all 4 men single-handedly. Helen sank onto their old rocking chair, the badge heavy in her palm. James had never told her about his law enforcement background, had never mentioned that he'd once worn a star and carried the authority to bring justice to lawless places. He'd simply appeared in Silver Ridge one day, a quiet man with gentle hands and a mysterious past, looking for work and a place to settle down. Now she understood where Rosie's fearless sense of justice came from. It wasn't just inherited stubbornness. It was the legacy of a man who'd spent years standing up to dangerous people and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The courage her daughter had shown in facing Tex Bridger wasn't reckless. It was instinctive, passed down through bloodlines like eye color or the shape of her smile. Meanwhile, Tex had risen before dawn and ridden to Silver Ridge with a purpose he couldn't quite name. Instead of his usual intimidating patrol through the main street, he found himself drawn to the quiet residential area where Rosie lived. He dismounted a respectful distance from the McKinnon house and simply stood there, holding the wooden horse and trying to understand what was happening to him. That's when he heard it, the sound of quiet sobbing coming from behind the general store. Following the sound, he discovered a sight that shattered what remained of his carefully constructed emotional walls. Rosie sat huddled against the back wall of Hawkins' store, her small shoulders shaking with tears. Her blue dress was torn at the knee, and there was dirt on her face as if she'd fallen. But what broke Tex's heart was the way she was crying, not the loud, demanding wails of a child who expected comfort, but the quiet, hopeless sobs of someone who'd learned not to expect rescue. "Hey there, little one," Tex said softly, his voice gentler than it had been in 20 years. "What's wrong?" Rosie looked up, her tear-streaked face brightening slightly at the sight of him. "Mr. Tex, you came back." "I did," he confirmed, settling down beside her with a care that surprised them both. For such a large man, he moved with unexpected grace, lowering himself to her level so she wouldn't have to crane her neck to look at him. "Now tell me what's got you crying." "Tommy Patterson and his friends," Rosie said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "They said mean things about my daddy. They said he was a coward who ran away from fighting, and that's why their daddies have to be brave while mine is dead." Tex felt a rage building inside him that was different from any anger he'd known before. This wasn't the cold, calculating fury that had driven him to kill. This was the protective wrath of someone who cared deeply about the person being hurt. Boys say stupid things sometimes, Tex said carefully. Doesn't make them true. But what if it is true? Rosie's voice was small and broken. What if Daddy really was a coward? What if that's why he never told us he used to be a deputy? Tex's eyebrows shot up. Your father was a lawman? Rosie nodded miserably. Mama found his badge this morning. She showed it to me, but I don't understand why he kept it secret. Maybe he was ashamed because he quit. The pieces of a puzzle Tex didn't know he'd been solving suddenly clicked into place. James McKinnon, a name that had been nagging at the back of his memory since he'd first heard it. He'd known a Deputy James McKinnon years ago, back when he was still Thomas Brennan, and the world made sense. They'd crossed paths during a cattle drive, and Tex remembered thinking the young lawman had the kind of quiet strength that made dangerous men think twice about causing trouble. Your father wasn't a coward, Tex said with absolute certainty. James McKinnon was one of the bravest men I ever knew. Rosie's eyes widened. You knew my daddy? I did. This was years ago, before... Tex paused, unsure how to explain the transformation that had turned him from a decent man into a killer. Before I became who I am now. Your father helped me once when I was in trouble. He didn't have to, but he did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. The lie came easily, but it wasn't entirely false. Tex could imagine James McKinnon helping people in trouble. It fit everything he'd observed about the man's character through his daughter's eyes. And in that moment, sitting beside this heartbroken child, Tex decided that some truths were less important than healing a little. Girl's wounded heart. Really? Rosie's tears had stopped, replaced by desperate hope. Really? Tex confirmed. Your father was the kind of man who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That's what real courage looks like. Not picking fights, but protecting those who need protecting. Rosie wiped her face with her sleeve, leaving streaks in the dirt on her cheeks. Then why did Tommy's daddy say those things? Because some folks don't understand that the bravest thing a man can do sometimes is walk away from violence, Tex said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Your father came here to build something good. A family. A peaceful life. That takes more courage than any gunfight. As he spoke, Tex realized he was describing the very thing he'd thrown away when grief and rage consumed him. James McKinnon had made the choice Tex should have made, to honor his family's memory by creating new life and love instead of spreading death and fear. Will you help me tell Tommy he's wrong? Rosie asked, with touching faith in his ability to solve her problems. Tex felt something shift inside his chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for decades. This child was asking him to be her protector, to use his fearsome reputation for good instead of evil. The irony was staggering. The most innocent person in Silver Ridge was asking the most dangerous person to help her with schoolyard bullies. I think I can do better than that, Tex said, making a decision that would change everything. How would you like me to tell you some stories about your father? Real stories about the brave things he did? Rosie's face lit up like sunrise. You'd do that? I would, Tex said, and meant it completely. If she needed heroes, he would give them to her, even if he had to invent them from whole cloth. This child had shown him kindness when he deserved nothing but fear. The least he could do was return the favor by protecting her from cruel words and broken hearts. As they sat together behind the general store, Tex began to weave tales of Deputy James McKinnon's courage and honor. Some were memories of the real man he'd known briefly, others were pure fiction, but all were crafted with the careful love of someone who understood that stories could heal wounds that reality had left bleeding. For the first time in 20 years, Tex Bridger was using his words to build something up instead of tearing it down. And as he watched Rosie's smile return, he began to understand that redemption might be possible after all. One small act of kindness at a time. Sunday evening brought a moment of reckoning that neither Tex nor Rosie had expected. They'd been meeting regularly for 3 days now, always behind the general store, where curious eyes couldn't intrude on their unlikely friendship. Rosie would bring her carving tools and work on new wooden animals, while Tex told stories about her father's heroic deeds, some real, some imagined, all designed to build up the legacy of a good man in his daughter's heart. But this evening was different. As Rosie worked on a wooden bird, her small knife slipped and opened a cut on her thumb. She cried out in pain and surprise, and without thinking, Tex immediately pulled out his bandana to wrap her injured hand. "There now," he said gently, his massive fingers surprisingly delicate as he tended to her wound. "It's not deep. Just needs a little—" He stopped mid-sentence, staring down at Rosie's small hand in his own. For a moment time seemed suspended, and then the dam that had held back 20 years of grief finally burst. "Lucy," he whispered, his voice breaking. Like a dam in flood season, Rosie looked up at him with concern. "Who's Lucy, Mr. Tex?" Tex's hands began to shake as memories crashed over him with the force of a landslide. The careful walls he'd built around his heart crumbled in an instant, and suddenly he was back in that burned-out house outside Abilene, holding his daughter's lifeless body and screaming at a God who had allowed such evil to exist in the world. "She was—" His voice caught and he had to start again. "She was my little girl. She was 7 years old, just like you." The words came pouring out then, 20 years of bottled anguish spilling forth like water through a broken dam. He told Rosie about Lucy's laugh, about the way she used to bring him flowers from the meadow behind their house, about the wooden toys he'd carved for her birthdays. He told her about Margaret, his wife, who had the kindest heart and the most beautiful smile in 3 counties. And then, with his voice raw from emotion, he told her about the morning when everything ended. "They came while I was working in the fields," Tex said, his eyes fixed on something Rosie couldn't see. 5 men, looking for money and supplies. When Margaret told them we didn't have anything worth stealing, they—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. But Rosie, with the intuitive wisdom of a child who'd lost her own father, understood without needing the details. "They hurt them," she said softly. Tex nodded, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "When I got back to the house, it was too late. They were gone. And my family was—" He shook his head, still unable to say the words aloud. "I buried them under the old oak tree where Lucy used to play, and then I went hunting." "You wanted to make the bad men pay," Rosie said, her voice filled with understanding rather than judgment. "I wanted to kill them all," Tex admitted, the brutal honesty, shocking even himself. "And I did. Every last one of them. But killing them didn't bring my family back. It just made me into something my wife and daughter never would have recognized." He reached into his saddlebag with trembling hands and pulled out a charred piece of paper, all that remained of a family portrait that had hung over their fireplace. The fire had burned away most of the image, leaving only fragments of faces and the suggestion of happiness that had once been. "This is all I have left of them," he said, holding the burned photograph with the reverence others might reserve for. "Religious relics. 20 years I've been carrying this around, trying to hold on to who they were while forgetting who I used to be." Rosie studied the damaged photograph, her young mind working to process the enormity of what she'd just learned. The most feared man in 3 counties, the nightmare that had haunted Silver Ridge for 2 decades, was really a father who'd lost everything and never found his way back home. "She looks like she was happy," Rosie said finally, pointing to the barely visible outline of a small face in the photograph. "She was," Tex whispered. "She was the happiest little girl in the world. She loved everyone and everything, just like—" He stopped, looking at Rosie with new understanding. "Just like you do." The realization hit them both at the same time. Rosie's fearless kindness, her inability to see evil where others saw only monster, her 7-year-old wisdom about hurt people and healing, it was all so painfully familiar. To a man who'd once known another little girl with the same beautiful spirit. "That's why you couldn't hurt me," Rosie said with sudden comprehension. "I remind you of her." Tex nodded, fresh tears falling onto the burned photograph. "From the first moment you stood up to me, all I could see was Lucy, the way she used to. Look at the world like it was full of magic, the way she never met a stranger, the way she believed everyone was good deep down inside. Maybe she sent me to find you, Rosie suggested, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of childhood. Maybe she knew you needed someone to remind you how to be her daddy again. The words hit Tex like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and the strength from his limbs. In all his years of violence and rage, he'd never considered that possibility, that his daughter's spirit might still be working in the world, trying to guide him back to the light. "I don't know how to be anything but angry anymore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you do," Rosie said with absolute certainty. "You've been practicing with me. You know how to tell stories and bandage cuts and listen when someone's sad. That's what daddies do." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached their ears. But these weren't the measured steps of a single horse. This was the thunder of multiple riders moving fast, with purpose and malice aforethought. Tex's head snapped up, his survival instincts honed by 20 years of violence screaming warnings. He knew that sound, had heard it countless times before. Armed men riding hard, looking for trouble. "Get behind me," he said, his voice instantly transforming from broken father to deadly protector. Through the dust and fading sunlight, 5 figures appeared at the end of Main Street. Even from a distance, Tex could see the deliberate way they moved, the confident spread of their formation, the glint of weapons in the evening light. These weren't travelers or merchants. These were men who'd come to Silver Ridge with violence on their minds. And unless Tex was very much mistaken, they'd come looking for him. "Rosie," he said urgently, pressing the wooden horse into her hands, "I need you to run home right now. Find your mother and tell her to lock the doors and stay away from the windows." "But what about you?" Rosie asked, fear finally entering her voice, not fear of him, but fear for him. Tex looked down at this remarkable child who'd somehow managed to find the man he used to be, buried beneath 20 years of anger and pain. For the first time since his family's death, he had something worth protecting again. "I'm going to do what your father would have done," he said quietly. "I'm going to keep you safe." As Rosie ran toward home, clutching the wooden horse, Tex Bridger faced the first truly clear choice he'd made in 20 years. The 5 riders approaching Silver Ridge weren't random troublemakers. They were the Crenshaw gang, led by a vicious killer named Blackjack Crenshaw, who'd been hunting Tex for the better part of a decade. Their presence here meant someone had talked, someone had given away his location, and now innocent people were going to pay the price for his past sins. Tex's modified Colt 45 felt different in his hand tonight as he checked the chambers and cleaned the barrel with practiced efficiency. The weapon had been his constant companion for 2 decades, responsible for 23 deaths and countless acts of intimidation. But as he prepared it now, his purpose wasn't murder or revenge. It was protection. For the first time since he'd carved those original notches in his gun belt, Tex was preparing to fight for someone else instead of against them. The irony wasn't lost on him that Blackjack Crenshaw had been one of the 5 men who'd murdered his family all those years ago. Tex had tracked down and killed 4 of them in his initial rampage of revenge, but Crenshaw had vanished like smoke, staying 1 step ahead of justice for 20 years. Now he'd come to collect what he saw as a debt, Tex's life in payment for the deaths of his partners. Word of the approaching riders spread through Silver Ridge with the speed of wildfire. But instead of the usual panic and hiding, something unprecedented began to happen. Doors opened cautiously, and faces appeared. At windows, not to cower in fear, but to watch and wait. The sight of Tex Bridger standing in the middle of Main Street, not as a threat, but as their protector, had fundamentally changed the town's understanding of their situation. Sheriff Dalton emerged from his office for the first time in years, when armed men had come to town. His hand shook as he checked his own weapon, but his jaw was set with determination. If Tex Bridger was willing to stand and fight for Silver Ridge, Then by God, maybe it was time for the sheriff to remember what his badge meant. Mrs. Patterson appeared on her front porch, carrying her late husband's hunting rifle. Mr. Hawkins stepped out of his store with a shotgun. One by one, the townspeople who'd spent 20 years living in fear began to emerge, armed and ready to defend their home. They'd watched a 7-year-old girl face down their worst nightmare with nothing but courage and kindness, if she could. Be brave, then so could they. At the McKinnon house, Helen held her daughter close, while watching through the window as Tex took his position in the street. Rosie had delivered his message about locking doors and staying safe, but she'd also told her mother about the burned photograph and the story of a man who'd lost everything and forgotten how to find his way home. "He's protecting us, isn't he?" "Mama?" Rosie whispered against her mother's shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart," Helen replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I think he is." Helen reached into her jewelry box and pulled out James's deputy badge, the tarnished star catching the last rays of sunlight through the window. Without hesitation, she pressed it into Rosie's small hands. "Take this to him," she said quietly. "Your father would want him to have it." Rosie looked up at her mother in surprise. "But you said to stay inside. Sometimes we have to choose between being safe and doing what's right," Helen said, echoing words her husband had spoken to her years before. "Your daddy understood that, and I think Mr. Tex is learning it too." As the Crenshaw gang drew closer, their intentions became unmistakably clear. These weren't men looking for supplies or shelter. They were killers who'd come to settle an old score, and they didn't much care who got hurt in the process. Blackjack Crenshaw himself rode at the front, his scarred face twisted into a permanent sneer, his black duster flowing behind him like the wings of some carrion bird. "Well, well," Crenshaw called out as they entered the main street, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with violence. "If it ain't the famous Tex Bridger playing sheriff in this dusty little nothing of a town." Tex stood perfectly still in the center of the street, his hand resting easy on his gun, but not yet drawn. Around him, he could hear the subtle sounds of his neighbors taking defensive positions, the soft click of rifle hammers being cocked, the whisper of feet moving to better cover. For the first time in 20 years, Tex wasn't standing alone. "Jack," he said simply, his voice carrying across the space between them like a death sentence. "Figured you'd show up eventually." "Oh, I've been looking forward to this for a long time," Crenshaw replied, his gang spreading out in the classic formation for a street fight. "You killed my brothers, Bridger. Time to pay the price. Your brothers were murderers and cowards," Tex said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "They got exactly what they deserved." "Maybe so," Crenshaw admitted with a shrug, "but that don't change the fact that you owe me 4 lives. Of course, I'm willing to negotiate. Give me the town, let my boys have some fun with the good folks of Silver Ridge, and I might let you ride away." The casual cruelty in Crenshaw's voice, the offhand way he discussed terrorizing innocent people, crystallized everything that had been changing inside Tex's heart. This was what he could have become, if Rosie's courage hadn't shown him another path. This was the monster he'd been dancing with for 20 years, and it was time to put it down permanently. "I've got a counter-offer," Tex said, his hand moving closer to his gun. "You and your boys ride out now, and I'll let you live long enough to find some other town to terrorize." Crenshaw's laugh was like breaking glass. "That's real generous, considering you're outnumbered 5-1. "Actually," came a voice from the boardwalk, "it's more like 5-10. Sheriff Dalton stepped into view, his badge glinting in the fading light, and his revolver steady in his hand. Behind him, Mr. Hawkins appeared with his shotgun, followed by Mrs. Patterson with her rifle. One by one, the citizens of Silver Ridge emerged from their hiding places, armed and determined. But the most powerful moment came when Rosie McKinnon walked calmly into the street, carrying her father's deputy, badge in her small hands. The sight of a 7-year-old girl walking fearlessly toward armed killers brought a hush over the entire scene. "Mr. Tex," she said, holding up the badge, "Mama wants you to have this. She says Daddy would want you to wear it." Tex looked down at the tarnished star, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. This wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of everything James McKinnon had stood for, everything Tex had once been and could be again. It was a badge of honor, a promise of protection, a covenant with the very people he'd spent 20 years terrorizing. With hands that shook only slightly, Tex pinned the deputy's badge to his vest, right over his heart. The metal felt warm against his chest, as if it carried the spirit of the good man who'd worn it before. "Thank you, little one," he said softly. "Now get behind the sheriff where it's safe." As Rosie ran to safety, Tex faced the Crenshaw gang. With a new understanding of what he was fighting for, this wasn't about revenge or survival. This was about redemption. This was about proving that even the most lost soul could find its way back to the light. "Last chance, Jack," Tex called out, his voice carrying the authority of the badge he now wore. "Ride away now or face the consequences." Crenshaw's response was to draw his gun. The battle for Silver Ridge and for Tex Bridger's soul was about to begin. The first shot shattered the evening stillness like thunder, and suddenly the quiet street of Silver Ridge erupted into chaos. Blackjack Crenshaw's bullet splintered the wooden sign that marked the town limits, the same bullet-riddled, weathered marker that had welcomed visitors to Silver Ridge for 30 years. Now it became the symbolic battleground where everything would be decided. Tex's response was lightning fast, his modified Colt 45 clearing leather with the fluid motion of 20 years' practice. But instead of aiming to kill, his first shot deliberately went wide, splintering the post next to Crenshaw's head, a warning that spoke louder than words. The old Tex would have put a bullet between the man's eyes without hesitation. This new version, wearing James McKinnon's badge and fighting for something greater than revenge, was giving his enemy one last chance to choose differently. Crenshaw's gang spread out along the street with practiced precision, taking cover behind water. Troughs and hitching posts, their weapons gleaming in the dying light. These weren't random drifters or desperate men. They were seasoned killers who'd spent decades perfecting the art of violence. Their movements were coordinated, their positioning strategic, and their intent absolutely clear. But they hadn't counted on facing an entire town, united in purpose. From the windows and doorways of Silver Ridge came answering gunfire as the townspeople defended their home with a courage they'd forgotten they possessed. Every shot fired by the citizens carried 20 years of suppressed anger and newfound hope. Sheriff Dalton's first shot took down one of Crenshaw's men, the bullet finding its mark with surprising accuracy for a lawman who hadn't drawn his weapon. In anger for 15 years, the outlaw spun around and crashed into the hitching post, his rifle clattering across the wooden planks. The sound of Dalton's gun seemed to awaken something that had been sleeping in his soul, the memory of what it meant to protect and serve rather than simply survive. "That's for every night I was too scared to wear this badge," Dalton muttered, working the action on his rifle with hands that no longer shook. Mrs. Patterson's hunting rifle boomed from her front porch, the shot going wide but close enough to send two outlaws scrambling for better cover. Her second shot was more accurate, taking a chunk out of the wooden post one of them was hiding behind and sending splinters flying like shrapnel. "That's for making me lock my doors for 20 years, she shouted, chambering another round with grim determination. Mr. Hawkins emerged fully from his store, his shotgun roaring as he advanced down the boardwalk. The spreading pattern of buckshot chewed splinters from the planks where Crenshaw's men had been standing moments before, forcing them to give ground. "And that's for every customer you scared away from my store," Hawkins declared, reloading with the smooth efficiency of a man who'd hunted these mountains since boyhood. But it was the sight of Tex Bridger fighting not for himself, but for others, that truly inspired the people of Silver Ridge. They watched in amazement as their former tormentor used his deadly skills to protect rather than destroy, his every move calculated to defend the innocent rather than spread fear. The transformation was so complete, so profound, that some could barely believe they were witnessing the same man who'd terrorized them for decades. Tex rolled behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead, his mind automatically cataloging positions and angles with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive through dozens of gunfights. But this time, his calculations included the safety of non-combatants, making sure his return fire wouldn't endanger the townspeople who'd found the courage to stand with him. "Behind you, deputy," called out Jake Sullivan from the saloon, his warning allowing Tex to spin and put a bullet in the shoulder of an outlaw who'd been trying to circle around for a killing shot. The casual use of his new title, deputy, filled Tex with a warmth that no amount of whiskey had ever provided. These people weren't just fighting alongside him, they were accepting him as one of their own, trusting him with their lives and the lives of their children. "You can't hide behind that badge forever, Bridger," Crenshaw shouted from his position behind an overturned wagon. "You're still the same killer you always were." "Maybe," Tex called back, pausing to reload with practiced efficiency, "but now I'm killing for the right reasons." His next shot was aimed with lethal precision, taking down another of Crenshaw's men who'd been trying to flank the sheriff's position. The outlaw dropped his weapon and fell clutching his shoulder, wounded but alive, because Tex had chosen mercy over murder. The old Tex would have aimed for the heart. This new version aimed to disable, to stop the threat without necessarily ending the life. Young Tommy Patterson, the same boy who'd taunted Rosie about her father's courage, watched from his family's window as the most feared man in 3 counties fought to protect the very people he'd once terrorized. The boy's face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide with amazement as he witnessed true courage in action. "Ma," Tommy whispered to his mother, "I was wrong about Deputy McKinnon, wasn't I? He really was brave." Mrs. Patterson glanced at her son between shots. "Yes, honey, and now you're seeing what real bravery looks like. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is change." The battle raged on as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, leaving Silver Ridge bathed in the purple twilight of approaching night. Muzzle flashes lit up the street like deadly fireflies, and the air filled with the sharp smell of gunpowder and the sound of splintering wood. The very atmosphere seemed charged with electricity, as if the town itself was fighting to survive. Tex took a bullet in his left shoulder, the impact spinning him around and slamming him against the water trough. Pain flared through his body like liquid fire, but he gritted his teeth and kept fighting. Blood soaked through his shirt, but his gun hand remained steady. He'd taken worse wounds in his 20 years of violence, but this time the stakes were different. This time he wasn't fighting for revenge or survival. He was fighting for redemption. "Deputies hit," someone shouted from the crowd, and Tex was amazed to hear genuine concern in the voice. When had anyone last cared whether he lived or died? From her position behind the sheriff, Rosie watched the man who'd become her unlikely protector, bleeding, but still standing, still fighting for people who'd spent 20 years fearing him. The wooden horse was clutched tight in her small hands, and she whispered prayers her father had taught her, asking for strength and courage for the man who was trying so hard to become someone worthy of a little girl's trust. "Please, God," she whispered, "don't let the bad men hurt Mr. Thomas. He's trying so hard to be good." Another of Crenshaw's men fell to the combined fire of the townspeople, his scream echoing off the buildings as he clutched a shattered leg. The coordinated defense was working. The outlaws were being pushed back, their numbers dwindling, their confidence shaken by the unexpected resistance. But Crenshaw himself remained dangerous and determined, his scarred face twisted with the rage of a man who'd waited 20 years for this moment. He'd lost 3 of his 5 men, but he showed no signs of retreat. If anything, the losses seemed to fuel his fury. "This ain't over, Bridger," he shouted, his voice carrying a promise of violence that made even the bravest townsfolk shiver. "You killed my blood, and I'm going to take payment in kind, starting with that little girl you're so fond of." The threat against Rosie sent a surge of protective rage through Tex that made his previous 20 years of anger seem like gentle irritation. The idea of this monster threatening an innocent child, his child, for that's how he'd come to think, of Rosie, filled him with a righteous fury that burned away pain and fear alike. "You want to dance, Jack?" Tex called out, his voice carrying across the battlefield with deadly calm. "Then let's dance. Just you and me, like it should have been 20 years ago." But as Tex checked his ammunition and prepared for the next assault, he realized something that filled him with quiet wonder. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't afraid to die, because he finally had something worth living for, and more importantly, he had something worth dying for, if that's what it took to keep it safe. Blood soaked through Tex's shirt from the shoulder wound, but his gun hand remained steady as stone. The pain was nothing compared to the clarity that filled his mind. For the first time in 20 years, he knew exactly who he was and what he was fighting for. The deputy's badge on his chest seemed to pulse with warmth, as if James McKinnon's spirit was lending him strength for this final confrontation. Black Jack Crenshaw made his move as full darkness settled over Silver Ridge, using the shadows to work his way closer to the center of town. His remaining men provided covering fire while he slipped from building to building, his scarred face twisted with murderous intent. This had gone far beyond settling old scores. Now it was about proving that fear would always triumph over hope, that monsters could never truly be redeemed. The outlaw leader moved with the deadly grace of a predator, his boots making no sound. On the wooden boardwalks, as he circled around behind the defenders' positions, 20 years of killing had taught him patience and cunning, and he intended to use every trick he'd learned to destroy the man who'd killed his brothers. Rosie saw him first. Her young eyes adapted to the darkness, spotting his black silhouette moving like a shadow between the buildings. Her heart hammered in her chest as she realized the danger, but instead of crying out in fear, she acted with the same courage that had defined every moment of her friendship with Tex. Without thinking, she pulled out her small white handkerchief, the one her mother had embroidered with tiny blue flowers during the long winter evenings, and began tearing it into strips. Her father had taught her basic first aid during his final illness, showing her how to clean wounds and apply pressure to stop bleeding. She could see that Mr. Tex was losing blood faster than he realized, his face growing pale despite his determined expression. "Mr. Tex," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve to get his attention, "you're hurt bad. You need to let me help you." Tex looked down in surprise, having forgotten the child was still nearby, despite his orders for her to stay with the sheriff. Part of him wanted to scold her for putting herself in danger, but instead he felt a wave of gratitude for her presence. Somehow this brave little girl had become his anchor to humanity, the reminder of who he could be instead of who he'd been. "Just a scratch, little one," he said softly, but allowed her to wrap the torn handkerchief around his wound. Her small hands were gentle but sure, and the simple act of care from someone who believed in his goodness gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. "My daddy taught me how to do this," Rosie said quietly as she worked, her fingers surprisingly steady for such a young child. "He said sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take care of someone who's hurting." The words hit Tex like a physical blow, reminding him of everything he'd lost and everything he'd found again in this remarkable child's friendship. "Your daddy was a wise man," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "He would have liked you," Rosie said with absolute certainty. "He always said that people could change if they really wanted to, and you wanted to change more than anybody." Around them, the battle continued to rage. Sheriff Dalton had taken position behind an overturned wagon, his rifle cracking steadily as he kept the remaining outlaws pinned down. Mrs. Patterson's hunting rifle boomed from her porch, each shot more accurate than the last as her old skills returned. Mr. Hawkins had moved to the corner of his store, using the building's cover to provide flanking fire. But the townspeople were tiring, their ammunition running low, and Crenshaw's surviving. Men were seasoned fighters who knew how to make every shot count. The outlaw leader had planned this carefully, knowing that if he could eliminate Tex, the town's resistance would crumble. That's when Crenshaw struck. The outlaw leader burst from the shadows behind the general store, his guns blazing as he made his final desperate play. His first shot scattered the townspeople, sending them diving for cover and breaking up their coordinated defense. The sudden assault from an unexpected direction threw the defenders into momentary confusion. Surprise. "You bastards!" Crenshaw roared, his voice carrying the savage joy of a man who lived for violence. "Time to pay the piper." His second volley was aimed directly at Tex, the bullets whining past his head with deadly precision. But Crenshaw's rage made him careless, and in his haste to end the fight he made a fatal error. He put Rosie directly in his line of fire. "Now you'll learn what it feels like to lose everything." Crenshaw snarled, his weapon swinging toward the child with deliberate malice. Tex saw the danger in the same instant that Rosie looked up from bandaging his wound, her young face caught in the moonlight like an angel's. Time seemed to slow as Crenshaw's gun swung toward her, his finger tightening on the trigger with the deliberate malice of a man who understood that the best way to destroy an enemy was to take away what he loved most. "No!" The word tore from Tex's throat like a battle cry, carrying 20 years of regret and a desperate prayer for redemption. Without conscious thought, Tex threw himself between the gun and the child, his body shielding her from the bullets that were meant to end her innocent life. The impact of 3 slugs hitting his chest drove him to his knees, but he never took his eyes off Crenshaw, never let his own weapon waver from its target. Pain exploded through his torso like liquid. Fire, but somehow it felt clean, purifying rather than destroying. This pain had meaning, had purpose. He was finally using his body to protect rather than intimidate, taking bullets meant for an innocent instead of delivering them to the helpless. "No!" Rosie's scream pierced the night air, her small hands reaching for the man who'd become her protector and friend, Mr. Thomas. But even as his life bled away into the dusty street, Tex felt a strange peace settling over him. The ghosts that had haunted him for 20 years, his wife Margaret, his daughter Lucy, seemed to be standing beside him now, their faces filled not with accusation, but with approval. He was finally the man they would have wanted him to be. Crenshaw's laughter was like breaking glass. "How's it feel, Bridger? How's it feel to watch someone you love die?" Tex felt his strength ebbing away like water through a broken dam, but he held on through sheer force of will. This was his moment of truth. The choice between the man he'd been and the man he could become. With his life bleeding away into the dusty street, he made his final decision. Blood frothed at his lips as he raised his gun one last time, his vision blurring, but his purpose crystal clear. Everything he'd ever been, every skill he'd acquired in 20 years of violence, focused down to this single moment of redemption. "It feels," Tex said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "like justice." His last shot was perfect, the bullet taking Blackjack Crenshaw center mass, spinning him around and dropping him into the dirt where he belonged. The outlaw leader's weapon fell from nerveless fingers, and his reign of terror ended with a final, gasping breath that carried his malice away into the desert night. "That's for my family," Tex whispered, his gun finally falling silent, "and for everyone else you ever hurt." The remaining members of Crenshaw's gang, seeing their leader dead and facing the united resistance of an entire town, broke and ran into the darkness. Their hoofbeats faded into the night, carrying them away from Silver Ridge forever, leaving behind only the peace they'd tried so hard to destroy. Tex collapsed fully now, his back against the bullet-riddled town sign, Rosie's, small hands pressing her handkerchief against his chest wounds in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. The townspeople gathered around them in a circle, their faces filled with wonder and gratitude for the man who'd given everything to protect them. "Did we win?" Tex asked weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Rosie said through her tears, her small hand finding his and holding tight. We won, Mr. Thomas. The bad men are gone, and they're never coming back. Sheriff Dalton knelt beside them, his own weapon finally holstered, his badge reflecting the moonlight. You did it, Tex. You saved us all. Not Tex, he corrected softly, his eyes finding Rosie's face one last time. Deputy Bridger. Deputy Thomas Bridger. That's right, Dalton said, his voice thick with emotion. Deputy Thomas Bridger, the bravest lawman this territory has ever seen. As consciousness began to fade, Tex heard something he hadn't heard in 20 years, the sound of the church bell ringing across Silver Ridge. Someone had climbed up to the bell tower and was pulling the rope, sending bronze notes of celebration, and hope echoing across the town that had finally learned to ring out its joy instead of hiding in silence. The sound was beautiful, pure, and filled with promise for the future. It rang out across the desert, carrying news of victory and redemption to anyone within miles who had ears to hear. The last thing Tex saw before darkness claimed him was Rosie's tear-streaked face, still holding his hand, still believing in the goodness she'd helped him find. In her eyes, he was no longer a monster. He was the hero she'd always known he could become. And in that moment, Thomas Bridger finally understood what his daughter Lucy had been trying to tell him all those years. That love was stronger than hate, that hope could triumph over despair, and that even the most broken souls could be healed by the courage of one small heart that refused to give up on them. 3 months later, the sound of hammering echoed across Silver Ridge as the townspeople worked together to install their new church bell, cast from the melted-down weapons of the Crenshaw gang and other instruments of violence that had plagued their community for too long. The bronze gleamed in the morning sunlight, its surface smooth and unmarked by the scars of its previous incarnation. Where once there had been tools of death, now there was an instrument of hope, celebration, and community gathering. Thomas Bridger stood watching from the porch of the small house the town had built for him. His left arm still stiff from the shoulder wound, but his chest wounds fully healed. The scars remained, 3 puckered marks that would always remind him of the night he'd chosen love over violence, but they felt like badges of honor now, rather than marks of shame. The townspeople had refused to let him leave Silver Ridge, even after he'd recovered enough to travel. You're our deputy now, Sheriff Dalton had said firmly during those first weeks of recovery. This badge belongs to you as much as it ever belonged to James McKinnon. Hell, maybe more. You earned it with your blood. The transformation in Silver Ridge was remarkable to behold. Children played freely in the streets, their laughter carrying on the desert wind like music. Merchants conducted business with open doors and friendly smiles, calling out greetings to neighbors as they went about their daily routines. The saloon had become a gathering place for community meetings rather than a refuge for drinking away fear and despair. Where once there had been an atmosphere of constant dread, now there was genuine warmth and fellowship. Mrs. Patterson had opened a small school in the back room of her house, teaching reading and arithmetic to children who'd been too frightened to venture out for formal education during the dark years. Mr. Hawkins had expanded his general store, adding a small lending library and a corner where folks could sit and share news over coffee. The whole town seemed to be blooming like a desert flower after a long-awaited rain, but the most remarkable transformation was in Thomas himself. The man who'd once been known as the most feared gunslinger in 3 counties now spent his days helping rebuild what his years of terror had torn down. He'd personally repaired every fence he'd broken, replanted every garden he'd trampled, and made restitution to every family he'd wronged. More than that, he'd become the town's unofficial protector and counselor, using his hard-won wisdom to help others find their way through darkness. His gun still hung at his hip, that would never change, but now it served protection rather than intimidation. When cattle rustlers threatened the Jenkins ranch, Deputy Bridger rode out to discourage them with nothing more than his presence and his reputation reformed. When a group of drifters tried to shake down the general store, they found themselves facing not just one lawman, but an entire community that had learned the power of standing together. The change hadn't come without challenges. There had been dark nights when the old rage threatened to consume him again, when the whiskey called to him from across the room and promised to numb the pain that seemed carved into his very bones. But during those moments, he would look at the wooden horse Rosie had given him, now displayed prominently on his mantelpiece, and remember what it felt like to be someone's hero instead of their nightmare. Rosie McKinnon had become his constant companion and unofficial deputy, her small badge carved from wood and painted silver with loving care. She still brought him flowers every week, and he still told her stories, though now they were stories about building communities rather than destroying them, about healing rather than hurting, about second chances and the power of forgiveness. "Mr. Thomas," she said on this particular morning, tugging at his vest to get his attention, "when the new bell rings, will you help me hang the banner?" Thomas looked down at the carefully painted sign she'd been working on for weeks. "Welcome to Silver Ridge, a community of hope." The letters were slightly crooked, the paint a bit smudged, but it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Every imperfect brushstroke spoke of love and optimism, of a child's faith in the possibility of redemption. "I'd be honored, little deputy," he said, adjusting the wooden badge on her dress with the same care he'd once reserved for checking his weapons. The banner itself had become a community project. Helen McKinnon had contributed the finest white cloth from her sewing supplies. Mrs. Patterson had mixed the paints in her kitchen, consulting with everyone about the perfect shade of blue for the letters. Even Sheriff Dalton had pitched in, using his steady hand to outline the words before Rosie filled them in with patient, careful strokes. As the bell was finally lifted into position atop the newly rebuilt church tower, Thomas found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Helen McKinnon just the week before. She'd asked him about his intentions toward Silver Ridge, whether he planned to stay permanently or if he was just passing through on his way to somewhere else. "This is where I belong," he'd told her simply. "This is where I learned how to be human again." Helen had smiled at that, the same gentle expression her daughter wore when she was pleased about something. James would be happy to know his badge found its way to someone worthy of wearing it. "I'm not sure I'll ever be worthy," Thomas had replied honestly, "but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become the man that badge represents." The conversation had taken place in Helen's kitchen, over coffee and the apple pie she'd become famous for throughout the territory. It was a scene of such domestic normalcy that it still amazed Thomas, sitting at a kitchen table, discussing ordinary things with a woman who trusted him enough to invite him into her home. A year ago, such a thing would have been impossible. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "You know," Helen had said, refilling his coffee cup, "Rosie talks about you constantly. Mr. Thomas says this, Mr. Thomas thinks that. You've become quite the father figure to her." The words had hit him like a gentle blow to the chest. "I never thought I'd have that chance again," he'd admitted quietly. "Sometimes God gives us second chances in ways we don't expect," Helen had replied. "Rosie lost her father, and you lost your daughter. Maybe you were meant to find each other." Now, watching the townspeople celebrate their new bell with music and laughter, Thomas felt the truth of those words in his bones. He would never fully atone for the 20 years of violence and fear he'd spread across the territory, but he could spend whatever time remained to him protecting instead of destroying, building instead of burning, loving instead of hating. The bell's first official ring sent a pure, clear note across the valley, a sound so different from the harsh clang of gunfire and violence that had defined Silver Ridge for so long. Children stopped their games to listen, adults paused in their work, and for a moment the entire community stood united in appreciation of the simple beauty of hope made audible. The sound carried for miles, reaching every corner of the territory with its message of renewal and redemption. Travelers on distant trails heard it and felt their spirits lift without knowing why. Cowboys working cattle in far-off ranges paused in their labors, somehow sensing that something good had happened in the world. Rosie clapped her hands with delight, then ran to help her mother carry out the food they'd prepared for the celebration. The entire town had contributed something: fresh bread, roasted chicken, apple pies, and jugs of fresh cider. It was a feast born of gratitude and community spirit, a celebration of survival and renewal that would be remembered for generations to come. As the afternoon wore on and the festivities continued, Thomas found himself standing at the edge of the celebration, watching his neighbors, for that's what they were now, neighbors rather than victims, enjoy the peace they'd all fought to achieve. Sheriff Dalton joined him, offering a cup of cider and a companionable silence that spoke of friendship forged in fire. "Any regrets?" the sheriff asked eventually, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Thomas considered the question seriously, watching as Rosie played with the other children, her laughter bright as silver bells. 20 years of his life had been wasted on violence and revenge. 20 years that could have been spent building something good instead of tearing things down. But those wasted years had led him here, to this moment, to this community, to this chance at redemption. "Only that it took me so long to find my way home," he said finally. "Home," Dalton repeated thoughtfully. "That's what this place has become, hasn't it? For all of us," Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what the sheriff meant. Silver Ridge had become more than just a town. It had become a symbol of the possibility of change, of redemption, of second chances. People came from miles around now, not to hide from Tex Bridges' violence, but to see the community that had transformed fear into hope, hatred into love. Word had spread across the territory about the little girl who'd faced down the most dangerous man alive with nothing but courage and kindness. Traveling preachers used their story in sermons about the power of faith. Mothers told it to their children as a bedtime tale about bravery and compassion. It had become legend, but Thomas knew the truth was even more remarkable than the stories suggested. As the sun began to set over Silver Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the new church bell rang out across the valley one more time. Its voice carried farther than any gunshot ever had, reaching into distant corners of the territory with a message of hope and transformation that would echo through the years to come. The sound seemed to summon people from their daily labors, drawing them together in the town square for an impromptu moment of gratitude. Without anyone organizing it, the townspeople began sharing stories, not of the dark years they'd endured, but of the bright future they were building together. Mrs. Patterson spoke about the children in her school, how eager they were to learn, now that they felt safe. Mr. Hawkins talked about the letters he'd been receiving from other towns, asking for advice on how to build the kind of community Silver Ridge had become. Sheriff Dalton shared his plans for training other lawmen in the art of protecting rather than simply enforcing, and when they asked Thomas to speak, he looked out at the faces of people who'd once hidden from him in terror and now called him friend. "A wise little girl once told me that everybody has good in them, even when it's buried real deep," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Sometimes it just takes the right person to help dig it up. You folks, all of you helped me find the good I thought was dead and gone forever." His eyes found Rosie in the crowd, her small face beaming with pride and affection. "And if an old killer like me can change, then anybody can. That's the real lesson of what happened here. Not that one man found redemption, but that a whole community chose to believe in the possibility of something better." The applause that followed was soft but heartfelt, the kind of appreciation that comes from shared struggle and shared triumph. As the crowd began to disperse, families heading home for evening meals and quiet conversations, Thomas felt a deep sense of completion settle over his soul. And in that moment, standing among people who'd chosen to see the good in him despite everything he'd done, Thomas Bridger finally understood what his daughter Lucy had been trying to tell him all those years, that love was stronger than hate, that hope could triumph over despair, and that even the most broken souls could be healed by the courage of one small heart that refused to give up on them. The hardest battles he'd learned truly were the ones we fought against the demons we'd become. But with enough courage, enough love, and perhaps the faith of one small girl who refused to see monsters where others saw only fear, even the most lost souls could find their way back to the light. As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky above Silver Ridge, Thomas Bridger, Deputy Thomas Bridger, walked home to a house filled with warmth instead of whiskey, surrounded by a community that had taught him the most important lesson of all, that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be.